Amid the flames that engulfed Europe and Asia, World War II was not just a competition of armies and artillery. The real battlefield was taking shape somewhere behind the curtain of smoke and fire, where countries, with hidden fear, reached out to unknown technologies. The world knew that this war would not end with swords and guns. Every camp, in the basements of bases, in hidden factories and enclosed laboratories, was busy creating weapons that had never been seen before. In the early years of the war, everyone still believed that the battle would be decided by simple planes, armored tanks, and huge ships. But it soon became clear that the war had entered a new phase. At the heart of every army were scientists, engineers, designers, and specialists who silently wrote the future. The goal was to build a power beyond the conventional battlefield, to create weapons that would make distances meaningless, the sky an unknown realm, the seabed a place for invisible ambush, and the waves a new battlefield. In Germany, beneath the ruins of ruined cities and among the vast factories, secret plans were being made. Underground headquarters with thick concrete walls, manned by guards who didn't even know what they were guarding. There, jet engines, long-range bombers, and radio-controlled submarines were being built in silence. Engineers stared intently at the plans, lines that promised new possibilities, flying faster than anything ever experienced before, attacking from thousands of miles away and eavesdropping on enemy armies from across borders. On the other side, Britain and America were also in a silent competition. They knew that their enemy was advancing not only in the field, but also in the shadows. So they built laboratories far from the cities, centers where even the soldiers closest to them knew nothing. Scientists worked day and night on developing code-breaking systems, more accurate radars, and signal tracking devices. In rooms filled with vacuum tubes, tangled wires, and the smell of fresh soldering, the future of the world was being shaped. Even Japan, in the Pacific, in bases hidden deep in the jungle, was pursuing technologies that would target Allied ships from anywhere, weapons that would give divers, submarines, and airplanes new powers. Countries were known for their soldiers fighting on the front lines, but in reality, the real battle was fought on the blue pages of secret maps, in dark rooms and behind desks. These new technologies not only changed warfare, but also the human concept of power. Each secret project was a step towards a battle that could no longer be seen with the naked eye. In this battlefield, silence was more deadly than explosions, because no one knew what the enemy was preparing in the dark. And that was just the beginning. In the mountains, deep underground, and among structures lit only by the dim light of industrial lights, there was a heavy silence. A silence that was not nourished by peace, but by the secrets hidden behind it. Governments knew that every moment of war was an opportunity to outdo the enemy, and this superiority was achieved not by the number of soldiers, but by inventions that the world did not yet know how to name. The underground quickly became the heart of the battle, where technology flourished, far from the eyes of the world. In secret corridors, Nazi Germany pursued projects that blurred the line between fantasy and reality. Tunnels lined with thick concrete were filled with rooms lit by huge generators. Young engineers and veteran scientists worked side by side. On metal tables were wide plans showing the design of aircraft that could fly at altitudes that no enemy aircraft could reach. New engines in test chambers rumbled with a muffled sound, a sound that, if it had reached the surface, would have heralded a future for which the world was not ready. In another room, a group was studying signals intercepted from distant radios. Strange devices with glass tubes and tangled wires were arranged on the tables. The goal was to control the waves. Waves that had previously only carried sound were now transformed into a hidden weapon. The effort to create equipment that could disrupt the course of enemy aircraft or blind communications on the Allied fronts was proceeding in silence. Every signal, every noise, every wave mattered. Sometimes, just one of these waves could change the course of a battle. At the same time, parts of the base were dedicated to the construction of long-range weapons. The long walls concealed chambers where metals were being transformed into missiles that could destroy targets from hundreds of kilometers away. Technicians, faces covered in smoke and sweat, connected cables and tested fuels. Test explosions heard in the depths showed that these technologies were not just ideas, but reality in the making. But it was not only Germany that pursued such projects. In Britain, under gardens and quiet fields, complexes were built that bore no outward sign. Small entrances led to tunnels that extended for kilometers underground. Here, the focus was more on defense. The best mathematicians and physicists worked on decoding systems. Devices like bombs and later computer prototypes were built in environments that even the soldiers on guard didn't know about. The steady beat of gears and metal clicks was the silent music of information warfare. In another room, research on radar continued. Laboratories filled with strange, patched-up antennas pursued projects that were supposed to give armies new eyes. Maps of the coast and the sea lay alongside wave plates and intricate diagrams. Engineers worked night and day with only the vibration of generators to accompany them, trying to improve the accuracy of the devices. They knew that if they could spot the enemy before they saw him, the chances of victory would increase significantly. In America, secret projects were taking shape in the deserts. Flatlands that had once been nothing but sand and rock were now home to tall buildings and concrete bunkers. Innovative aircraft with new engines sat on the ground in vast test yards. Aviation technologies were developing to a level where speed and altitude were new concepts. Speed, previously unimaginable, was now the main goal. The tests were difficult and risky. Sometimes the plane exploded before takeoff. Sometimes it disappeared into the clouds, never to return. But these failures were the stepping stones to building the next generation of Iron Birds. In the depths of the seas, another competition was underway. Submarines with new systems were becoming tools for stealth attacks. Long-range radios, equipment for sending coded signals from below the surface, and devices that allowed the enemy to eavesdrop were all being developed in this dark, damp world. The experiments were sometimes accompanied by the deep sound of the water, and sometimes by the eerie silence when one of the submarines never returned to the surface. All these projects had something in common: silence, shadow, and speed. The goal of the effort was to reach unknown frontiers before the enemy. Every hour was crucial, every defeat bitter but instructive. The underground world was the real world of war, where the future was being shaped without anyone knowing it.
As the war dragged on, eyes turned to the sky more than ever. Where the first bombs had landed was now the stage for a new competition. A competition that measured not only speed and power, but also the ability to see, hide, and strike from unimaginable distances. The sky was no longer just a place to fly, it was a testing ground where the future of war was being shaped. In remote German bases, hidden from view by the enemy in the forests and airfields, the first jets were born. Engines that roared with a sound unlike any piston engine and promised speeds that pilots had only dreamed of before. Long, propellerless metal bodies with sharp, terrifying lines trembled on hidden runways. Engineers were all around them, examining every part carefully, knowing that one of these metal birds was going to change the course of the battle in the sky. When one of these jets took off, many didn't even have time to turn their heads to see it. It was so fast that observers could only follow its short roar. This new technology shocked Allied pilots. Planes that had been unrivaled suddenly found themselves faced with a rival that could climb twice as fast and disappear from sight before the gunfire could even begin. This was the beginning of a new era, an era where speed meant superiority. In England, alongside the radar tubes that spun to form defensive lines, engineers gathered to develop new aviation technologies. In laboratories far from the battlefields, they built devices that could calculate the distance of aircraft without direct vision. Combining this technology with a new generation of fighter and bomber aircraft, it changed air strategy at night. Pilots flying in total darkness were no longer alone. Radar was their eyes. In America, research progressed towards long-range bombers. The vast country became a factory that built engines day and night to conquer the skies beyond the Pacific Ocean. These iron birds, with long wings and massive bodies, could fly for hours, cross the ocean, and drop bombs on enemy cities and bases with terrifying precision. Pilots followed the course in cramped cockpits filled with mechanical devices. The cold at high altitudes was bone-chilling, but the missions continued without interruption. Every time they took off, they feared they might never return. In the midst of this competition, a new form of warfare was also emerging, the battle of visibility and stealth. Projects began to build aircraft with low radar signatures. Engineers began to develop airframes that could deflect or absorb waves. These ideas were crude, and many never saw the light of day, but the sparks would later set the course for future air wars. On the other hand, attempts were made to mine the skies, not with explosives, but with waves. Devices were developed that could mislead enemy aircraft or disrupt the guidance of bombers. Some attempts even led to the creation of devices that could blind radars by broadcasting jamming. The sky was filled not only with metal and fire, but also with waves and deception. In the Far East, Japan was following suit. Secret factories in the mountains built aircraft that could surprise enemy carriers. Special features such as long range or the ability to take off from very short runways were a priority, since many bases were under fire and there was no time to build large runways. Special air forces were trained for specific missions from which there was no return. Technology in some places was for increased survivability, in others for the final blow. In Europe, another battle was also being fought, the aerial reconnaissance battle. Light aircraft designed solely for photography flew over the front lines, taking pictures of enemy lines. The films were developed in underground dark rooms, and then analysts in rooms filled with maps identified new lines and structures. Every line, every shadow could be a sign of a new weapon and imminent attack. Airplanes in this era became hawks that determined the fate of the Earth. Every mission was a flight between life and death. The hot engines, the trembling fuselages, and the sound of bullets passing by were images that the pilots carried with them for the rest of their lives. But behind every flight were dozens of engineers, technicians, and scientists whose names were not even remembered. Those who in the darkness of the rooms built the future of war on railways and in flight. This part of the war was not just a competition between nations in the sky, but a competition in thought and daring. The sky grew more dangerous every day. But every day, a new discovery was also made in its heart.
In the days when the skies were filled with the roar of jets and radar, a hidden battle was also being waged in the dark depths of the sea. A battle waged not by light, but by silence. Here, beneath the surface of the sea, war took on a different meaning. Every meter of advance was fought in the heart of the suffocating pressure of the water, and every wrong sound called for death. Submarines, which in World War I were mostly simple tools of ambush, this time in World War II became silent monsters, iron monsters, capable of staying below the surface for days and cutting off the enemy's vital lines without being seen. At the center of this evolution were the Germans, with their U-boats, vessels that ruthlessly ambushed Allied supply ships. But what made these sea monsters even more dangerous was the birth of radio communication systems designed specifically for submarines. Previously, commanders had to surface and raise their antennas to receive orders or send reports, an act that quickly gave away their position. But now, the new encrypted frequencies allowed submarines to receive messages only when they approached the surface and then plunged back into the darkness. Inside the metal hull were cramped rooms where radio operators worked carefully. Devices with yellow and green lights, rotating dials, and thick cables were the heart of submarine communications. Operators listened carefully to every wave and frequency. Many messages were sent using complex encryptions, such as the Enigma, a device whose rotating keys and internal wiring turned each message into a riddle that only the equipped receiver could read. When command messages were sent from Berlin, soldiers would gather in the rooms of the submarines. The commander would look at the decoded text and set a course. Sometimes the goal was to attack a convoy of enemy ships, sometimes to pursue a lone ship in the middle of the ocean. No one knew what awaited. Just silence, water, and command. The Allies did not sit idly by in the face of this threat. The submarine hunters were equipped with sonar equipment, devices that, by emitting sound waves, received their reflections from the metal hull of the submarine. The short sonar pings echoed through the control rooms, and the technicians listened carefully. Every reflection, every change could indicate the location of an enemy submarine. The hunt in the dark continued on both sides. At the same time, a new idea was developing: radio communication between submarines and aircraft. Aircraft that were patrolling the ocean to support ships would receive coded messages and be sent to areas where submarines were likely to be present. In some operations, the aircraft would fly low and drop special bombs, effectively forcing the submarine to climb, and this climb sometimes cost it its destruction. But the danger was not only from planes and sonar. On the decks of Allied ships, small rooms were built where men with headphones would listen for the slightest interference in the radio waves. These men were sound hunters. They searched for frequencies that might reveal the submarine's tracks. A front commander had only to send the wrong message or respond with the wrong frequency. His position would be recorded on enemy maps. The waves had become a battlefield. In the cold waters of the Atlantic, there were nights when submarines, using new systems for receiving messages, would ambush large convoys en masse. They would attack from all directions. Even if one submarine was destroyed, the others would continue their mission. Supply ships, tankers, passenger ships, they were all targets. Each attack would send flames across the sea. Oil would ignite, turning the black water red. Sailors would escape in small boats, but there was a greater fear in the ocean, that at that very moment, another submarine might be approaching. Sometimes, the fear of an attack would last for hours. In the depths of the submarine, life was nothing but hardship. The humid air, the smell of oil, the limited food, and the cramped space all took their toll on the soldiers. Drinking water was scarce, and the artificial light was tiring on the eyes. But the radio was hope. With each message, the war continued. Sometimes the messages were just a few words. Change course. Big catch in the north. Wait. That was enough to change course hundreds of kilometers. On the other side, Allied scientists were trying to break the codes. A great decoding operation began. Rooms full of giant machines that were constantly testing keys to break the codes. The breaking of the codes was a turning point in underwater warfare. From the moment the messages were read, the hunter and the hunted changed places. Now the submarines themselves were under the invisible watch of the waves. The depths swallowed the silence. Every radio wave was perhaps the last wave. And the sea, as always, kept secrets in its heart.
World War II did not only take place on land and in the sky. In the basements, behind the metal doors of laboratories, and in rooms that could only be entered with a code and permission, a silent battle was also waged. Here, a battlefield was fought not with bullets, but with knowledge and technology, where engineers, scientists, and code breakers worked with obsession and anxiety on plans that might one day change the fate of their country. In the heart of the mountains and forests, facilities were built that were hidden from the world's eyes. In Germany, projects with code names were carried out, projects that aimed to test a new generation of weapons, rocket engines, guided weapons, precision navigation systems, and even weapons that worked on waves. Men in white coats, alongside armed soldiers, worked on plans that no one was allowed to talk about. In one of these facilities, engineers were working on weapons that could fly over borders and strike a city or command center from a great distance. The launch pad was built in the wilderness, and long metal tubes were installed on it. At night, the parts were transported separately so as not to be noticed by Allied reconnaissance aircraft. In the control rooms, men stood behind machines whose hands spun non-stop. Each test was accompanied by a tremor in the ground and sky, a tremor that sometimes promised success, sometimes failure. Alongside these efforts, other projects were also moving forward simultaneously. Some of the tests were aimed at improving stealth capabilities. Using special coatings, anti-reflective paints, and new materials, engineers attempted to make planes and ships invisible to enemy radar. New jamming devices were developed to distort enemy signals and give them false information. In the basements of Britain, agents worked silently to break enemy codes. Halls filled with huge machines, powered by cogs and cables, operated day and night. The sound of metal clanging against metal and the sound of wheels turning became the music of these laboratories. Weary, red-eyed men traced numbers and lines through piles of paper. The effort to break the codes was a never-ending race, a race that began anew with each new message. In another corner, scientists were trying to design instruments that could listen, record, and analyze enemy waves at high speed. Special radios with extremely wide ranges were always on. Soldiers sat day and night, scanning the frequencies. Every faint sound might be a signal of an important order or the movement of a submarine. These men were the ears of an army. On the other hand, the United States was trying to develop very long-range bombers. This goal led to the development of new technologies that would later play a role in distant wars. In huge aircraft factories, operating around the clock, engineers and workers were assembling metal parts at an unprecedented speed. Far from the noise of the battlefield, the sound of hammers and the flame of welding machines was a sign of another war. But it was not all about building weapons. Part of the research focused on protecting the troops. More durable helmets, waterproof clothing, emergency medicines, and new treatments for wounds and diseases were designed. Doctors and researchers, under extreme pressure, sought ways to delay death. In many of these projects, time was the enemy. Every day of delay could mean the loss of a front. In Japan, secret facilities were built on various islands, where experiments were carried out on small but fast aircraft. Efforts were also underway to develop guided missiles, but lack of resources and the pressure of war slowed progress. However, the projects continued until the last months of the war. Amidst all these efforts, there was one thing in common: secrecy. Scientists hid their real names, projects were numbered, and results were kept secret only in narrow circles. People didn't even know exactly what another group was working on, just a little further away. Fear of espionage was everywhere. Sometimes the experiments resulted in disasters, explosions that shook buildings, fires that took weeks to put out. But every failure was hidden behind doors. Only the successes were recorded and moved on to the next stage. In the end, the results of these silent experiments changed the world of warfare. The technologies born in these dark rooms found their way onto the battlefield, many of which became the basis for major post-war developments. In this secret war, The soldiers didn't carry guns, but their weapons determined the fate of the great scenes of battle.
In the days when the battle raged on land and in the sky, a new chapter in the war was born. A chapter that separated the battlefield from the front line and brought distant cities, factories, and command centers into the direct line of fire. This chapter began with long-range missiles, weapons that could be fired from hundreds of kilometers away without a pilot, claiming dozens of lives before they were even heard. Germany, long under relentless Allied bombing, turned to technologies that could strike beyond the line of sight to turn the tide of the war. Launch pads and assembly workshops were built in dense forests and places that were hard to find even on maps. Tall metal shells lay in silence on the ground, and engineers carefully tightened the last bolts. The faces were tired, the work was done around the clock, and each test was a step towards a weapon that would terrify the world. The first prototypes were shaky and flawed. Some exploded in the air before reaching their destination. But when the first operational missiles were ready, the silence was the beginning of disaster. Without a continuous engine, with only the initial thrust of the launch, they made their way through lands that did not even know what was happening above them. In distant cities, in the middle of the morning or midnight, an explosion would suddenly split the sky. No sirens had time to warn. People would only hear the sound of the explosion before they realized what had happened. When the first missiles hit London, a great shock went through Europe. This was a form of warfare that had never been seen before. There was no plane in the sky to target. There were no pilots to capture. A single piece of metal would fall from the sky, flattening a neighborhood. Rumors spread quickly. People gave them names and lived each day in fear of the sound that didn't come. Emergency meetings were held in Allied command rooms. Maps were opened. Routes were explored that might lead to the origin of the attacks. Reconnaissance planes flew over Germany to find launch pads, but many of them moved quickly or remained hidden in forested areas and underground tunnels. The battle was changing from direct confrontation to shadow chasing. At research bases, German engineers were working on a new generation of missiles. Missiles with hybrid engines, stabilization systems, and rudimentary guidance devices. Some tests were conducted using internal gyroscopes, devices that maintained orientation and kept the missile on course. Designs became more complex, faster, and with longer ranges. Sometimes, the tests were disastrous. The missiles would veer off course after launch and crash near their bases. But with each failure, new data was recorded and refinement continued. The ultimate goal was a weapon that could hit a distant city with high precision. And that goal engaged many scientists, both those who were enthusiastic and those who, in their hearts, feared the fate of the technology. In the Allies, the response followed two paths. One was to try to destroy the launch pads, and the other to design warning and defense systems. But how could one defend against a weapon that approached silently and unseen? Engineers improved radars, but the missile's high speed and ballistic trajectory made the warning window very short. Eyes were on the sky, but the sky gave no sign. In cities like London, people had grown accustomed to the fact that every morning a street in the city was no longer there. Rescue teams searched through the fire and smoke for survivors. The constant sound of rubble clearing, the smell of broken cement, and hands searching through the bricks for signs of humanity never stopped. Missiles weren't just destroying buildings, they were burning the soul of the city. On the other side of the story, some scientists were hard at work in laboratories to develop more precise guidance systems. Some attempts were made to use radio to adjust the trajectory of missiles during flight, ideas that were never fully implemented due to the limitations of the time, but they laid the foundation for many future technologies. The idea that a weapon could be guided remotely was novel and dangerous, but the seeds of the future of warfare were sown there. In Japan, too, efforts were made to develop long-range weapons, but resource constraints and the pressures of war limited the pace of those projects. However, prototypes were built that could threaten enemy shipping lines from a distance. Every hand working on these projects knew that the world had entered a new era. The world saw that the age of bullets and artillery was not over, but that the shadow of new weapons had also fallen over it. From the moment the first missile hit the ground, no one was safe. Borders became meaningless. War entered a dimension where distance was an illusion, and death came silently from the sky.
While missiles rained down from the sky and submarines lurked in the depths of the sea, another front was quietly emerging. One ruled not by bullets, but by waves. Here, electronic warfare began, the battle that was to distort the course of messages, blind the eyes, and plunge the enemy command into darkness. At first, the task seemed simple. Listen to enemy messages and try to interfere with communications. But gradually, the techniques became more sophisticated. Radios were not just a means of transmitting orders. They became a battlefield. An army of specialists with headphones on their ears worked day and night behind crowded desks with instruments strewn with wires and lamps. They wandered through the waves, searching for the sound that might carry the fate of a ship or a battalion. In German command centers, there were groups whose sole job was to eavesdrop. They scanned Allied frequencies, recorded messages, and skillfully deciphered codes. Each message was a piece of the great puzzle of war. Sometimes, a single mispronounced word was enough to reveal the location of a military column or the route of a naval convoy. In this war, speech itself was a weapon, and the enemy was waiting to hear it. At the same time, the Allies were not idle either. Equipment was developed to confuse enemy frequencies. Jamming devices sent out waves that buried the message in a din of meaningless noise. In some operations, planes flew at high altitudes and broadcast unwanted signals, knocking out enemy radio communications. Sometimes, a single wave was enough to thwart a major attack. But that was only the beginning. Special teams worked in secret rooms to create devices that could create fake messages. These messages were arranged to look like they came from enemy units. In this way, columns of troops were sent in the wrong direction. Ships were directed along minefields, and sometimes a fake order was enough to lose a major battle. At Allied air bases, huge antennas and extensive listening networks monitored all of Europe. Every faint sound was analyzed. Some of these messages were covered in layers of code, codes that took months to decipher. In dark rooms, cryptographers hunched over papers, putting lines and numbers together, spending hours, days, and weeks with one goal in mind: to break the lock on a message. In this battle, the mind was the main weapon. On the other side, the Germans were working on similar experiments. They created devices that would produce powerful jamming and blind enemy radios. They also introduced devices that could locate the source of the signal. Thus, any radio transmitter operating on the front line was at risk. It only needed to be on for a few seconds for the enemy to find it. Communications were no longer a privilege. It was a danger. On many battlefields, radio silence was imposed. Units refused to send messages for fear of detection. Messengers traveled on foot or by motorcycle at night to deliver orders. But things did not always go according to plan. Sometimes one of these messengers would be killed in an enemy ambush, and with him, vital news. Here, minutes were gold. At sea, the battle of waves took on a different form. Sonars worked to find objects underwater, but the enemy tried to fool them. Devices were designed to produce a sound similar to a submarine, giving false signals. Ships followed a shadow, that did not exist. Time was lost, and the hunter lost his prey. Sometimes electronic warfare also extended to the sky. In some air operations, enemy waves disrupted navigational instruments. Pilots in the clouds, without seeing the ground, without access to accurate maps, had to find their way by their primitive senses. And sometimes these disturbances caused planes to deviate from their course, to arrive late, or not to reach their targets at all. Each wave could change fate. In the battle that raged every day, no one could be sure whether what they heard was truth or deception. Commanders listened carefully to the messages, analyzed them, and sometimes even responded with silence. Because they knew, in this war, sometimes silence is the only way to survive.
Far from the sounds of bullets and screams of the battlefields, behind thick concrete walls and no trespassing signs, another world was unfolding. A world of scientists, equations, test tubes, and a secret that could perhaps remake the world or destroy it. Deep in the forests of Poland, the deserts of America, the underground bunkers of Germany, and the shores of Britain, scientists worked day and night to create a superweapon, a weapon that could change the balance of war with a single blow. In Germany, secret projects emerged from the minds of Wernher von Braun and his team. Those who thought about the future, but the product of their thoughts was missiles that fell on cities. At their center were long, dark tunnels where workers built day and night under inhuman conditions. There were times when explosions could be heard from deep within the earth, explosions that were either the result of an experiment or a mistake that swallowed everything up. Engineers were working with technologies that seemed like magic to many people. Light alloys, powerful engines, smart fuses, and new generations of fuels. On the tables were designs for bombs that could be activated at a specific altitude, follow a specific target, or even explode at a specific time after hitting the surface. Each design had a glimmer of hope and a shadow of fear. In Britain, scientists had small, secret rooms. Behind covered windows, instruments sat on tables that were encrypted, decrypted, and re-encrypted. There, where the sound of cryptographic machines echoed day and night, minds were weapons. Every enemy message was an opportunity to find out what would happen in the future. But sometimes decoding a message at the cost of the lives of hundreds of people who were waiting for it. In America, a secret project began in the deserts of Nevada. A project whose name later shook the world. Workers, scientists, and soldiers lived in a fenced town. In this town, no one had the right to talk about what was being done. Even the closest friends did not know what the other was working on. Only one sentence was repeated many times in the mines. If the enemy gets to it sooner, we are doomed to destruction. Experiments were carried out one after another. Strange lights lit up the midnight sky. A sound like the roar of a mountain shook the earth. Some knew what was happening. The rest just prayed. In the oceans, scientists sought to build submarines that could stay underwater longer. New breathing systems, advanced radars, quiet fuel tanks. Each piece could save or destroy thousands of lives. In German laboratories, rumors swirled about weapons that worked with waves, silent weapons that could incapacitate a soldier without even firing a shot. Many dismissed it as fantasy, but the presence of such research in sealed folders showed that science was pursuing its own path, even if it led into darkness. Sometimes, scientists felt caught between two worlds, the world of science, whose goal was knowledge, and the world of war, which thought only of victory. Many of them later said, "We didn't know we were working for life or death." In the end, all these projects, whether they were building deadly bombs or inventing defense systems, together changed the face of war. But what few people knew was this: some of this research was never finished. Some of it was buried in folders or buried in underground tunnels, and others, years later, in new wars, they emerged from the darkness. Science, as much as it can save, can destroy. And in World War II, both of its faces were seen.
In the midst of all those towers, tunnels, and laboratories, there was another, less visible battle going on. The battle to obtain, hide, and sometimes steal secret technologies. Secret agents and technical spies searched through devices and blueprints, searching for the piece that would reveal the secret of a project. They would enter bases at night, take photographs, steal blueprints, and sometimes risk their lives to escape. These small intelligence convoys were often a mix of engineers and soldiers, men who could both navigate production lines and survive the battlefield. When a technical sample or important file was obtained, hundreds of people would gather in secluded rooms to analyze it. These analyses could change the course of research. A project that had been stuck in a technical deadlock for months was revived by a stolen note. But obtaining this information was not always easy. Bases were fortified, engineers were cautious, and classifications were tightly sealed. Many attempts were met with failure. Agents were arrested, files were burned or destroyed before reaching analysts, and sensitive equipment was dismantled or sent to the depths of the sea before it could be retrieved. In the field, sometimes a quick attack or a targeted bombing would cause a research facility to suddenly shut down, and all that had been built inside it would turn to dust and iron. Into the dust, recovery teams would come, men with flashlights and tool bags, searching the rubble for a piece or document of intelligence value. Finding a half-burned engine or a burned circuit board sometimes meant opening a new window on the enemy's capabilities. But the competition wasn't just about hardware. War software and human knowledge were also targets. Top engineers working on projects were sometimes secretly transferred or kidnapped so that their knowledge could be passed on. Some volunteered to leave home, work, and family to help the other side with information. Others switched sides under duress, threats, or promises of safety and security, such as a promotion. The presence of these individuals in the opposing camp could be worth several rounds of ammunition. On the other hand, the security forces of the projects also became more stringent. Special passports, alarm sirens, double-barred fences, and guards trained to report any unusual noises. But as the protection increased, so did the means of infiltration. Encrypted messages were hidden in authorized goods, contract workers were used as cover, and a network of local intelligence was formed that quickly relayed small reports to analysts.
One result of this competition was the creation of specialized units to counter these threats. Teams that were a mix of engineers, coders, and operations officers whose responsibility was to discover, neutralize, and then exploit enemy technologies. They had to face field attacks while trying to decipher the ideas, because any delay meant losing the advantage. In the meantime, joint operations between allies also took shape. Technical information was transferred from one country to another, and joint analysis teams worked on the data to gain a more complete picture of the enemy's capabilities. This cooperation was particularly valuable in cases where samples of equipment were obtained or engineers were surrendered. But mistakes and ethical consequences also occurred in these efforts. Some technologies were considered so dangerous or unethical that even those who had acquired them hesitated to use them. Research into chemical weapons or methods that could rapidly destroy civilian populations were controversial topics in closed circles. In some cases, it was decided to destroy samples or withhold results to avoid catastrophic consequences, both human and moral. But in the field, what ethics held together sometimes crumbled under strategic pressure. Another part of the battle was to try to prevent the enemy from stealing ideas. Scientists and engineers worked in a hierarchical manner, so that access to classified information was restricted. Only those who had a clear need for the information to perform their duties were allowed to see the full design. This approach slowed many projects because coordination between different departments became difficult, but military leaders saw it as a necessary cost of maintaining secrecy. At the same time, enemy special forces sometimes entered the field in unconventional ways, by spreading rumors, disrupting the supply chain, or even by infiltrating the intermediate factories that provided critical components. Cutting off a critical link in the supply chain could delay a project for weeks or months. These tactics demonstrated that technological warfare was not fought solely on laboratory benches. Logistics and supply networks were also vital battlefields. At the same time, some intelligence successes led to large-scale field operations, attacks planned with precise technical information and targeting structural weaknesses in factories. The attacks were often coordinated with nighttime bomber flights or sudden guerrilla raids to both destroy prototypes and weaken enemy production capacity. But sometimes these same actions released technologies previously stored in warehouses or tunnels. Explosions, fires, and destruction not only consumed materials and documents, but sometimes hid the key to secrets. Additionally, after capturing an area, the retaking forces were faced with a huge amount of information, incomplete devices, drawings, engineering notes, and samples that needed immediate examination. Many of these samples were transferred to research centers and dissected by international teams. Sometimes, a simple component would shed light on the cause of the failure of a complex system. And sometimes these same components would provide an idea for the development of a new generation of technologies. But analyzing these findings required time, resources, and experts. And on the battlefield, time was always short. In cases where technologies were coded or encrypted, the effort to break the codes became a separate operation, one that required years of cryptographic experience and specialized machinery. As a result, technical and decryption units became the vanguards of a new era, those who created power with data and figures as much as the soldier worked with volleys. This change of scenery later transformed the nature of military forces. Intelligence and technical units became an integral part of any fighting force. But in the same war, every success always came at a cost. The price of this secret battle was the lives of secret agents, as well as moral and human tensions that forced parts of history to be reconsidered after the war. And at the end of the day, when the laboratory lights went out, in a corner, an agent would scribble in a notebook a meaningless line whose true meaning might only one day be revealed. Stories of defeat and triumph in the shadows, the full details of which were never told to the public.
In the final years of the war, the world stood on shaky legs. Cities were piles of bricks, tunnels were steel graveyards, and fronts were lifeless strips of memory. But amidst the devastation, projects that had never been seen were taking their last breaths. Technologies built with fear and hope were now exploding, buried, or passing into new hands. In Germany, as the defenses collapsed and the Allied armies relentlessly advanced, engineers and scientists were thrown into disarray. Some were ordered to burn documents, blow up production tunnels, and bury sensitive samples in the basements. The sound of explosions at the mouths of caves that had once housed secret projects signaled that something was being destroyed, something that, if it had fallen into enemy hands, might have turned the tide of the war. Some of these technologies were never seen, half-finished projects that sank to the ground with hopes that never came to fruition. At shore bases, submarines that were supposed to create a new generation of naval warfare were hastily scrapped. Sailors who had trained for months underwater were now tasked with destroying the very thing they had hoped for. Parts of these submarines later sat silently on the ocean floor, their unfinished mission complete, no one knowing what secrets lay hidden within their worn iron. To the east, Japan was faced with a reality it had never expected. Technologies that had been quietly developed for years, long-range air systems, experimental engines, and advanced cryptographic programs were now on the verge of being shut down. Some bases were evacuated or destroyed without a shot being fired. A shadow of fear and compulsion hung over all. Researchers who had once worked day and night now stood in endless lines waiting to see what would happen to them: surrender, transfer, or death. But some projects were saved, not because of the designers, but because of the speed and bustle of war. Documents and samples fell into the hands of the advancing forces. Packed boxes containing plans, parts, and test results were sent like treasure to Allied laboratories. In silence, engineers and officers dissected the findings. Each piece told a story of hope and madness, a reflection of the minds of the designers who wanted to reach a new future through the ruins. In the United States and Britain, scientists debated behind closed doors whether to use or bury these technologies. Some believed that the findings could be tools to prevent future wars. Others believed that releasing such tools would lead to a new war. Some files were marked top secret and buried in dark archives. Others became the basis for a new generation of technology, from missiles to advanced propulsion systems. Alongside these scientific and political struggles were the people whose names never made history, the soldiers who retrieved parts from the battlefield, the officers who checked the codes at night, and the workers who unknowingly became part of building the future. Many of them never realized that the small piece they pulled from the rubble was worth as much as a mountain of gold. As the storm of war subsided, the laboratories fell silent one by one. But the silence that followed was heavier than any sound the world had heard in those years. Hidden in warehouses and iron boxes were plans, each of which could have marked a new chapter in the battle. Some emerged later, in wars and programs that shook the earth once again. Others remained in the heart of darkness, documents that may never see the light of day. And in the end, no one could deny that World War II was not made of fire and blood alone. It was the result of a race in the shadows, a race to build things beyond imagination. These secret weapons and projects, while not ending the war, did change the shape of the future. From the dark tunnels of Germany to the deserts of America, from the island bases of Japan to the basements of England, a common story emerged. Science, in the hands of man, can make the world or destroy it. With the end of the war, the plans were folded, the machines fell silent, and the shadows fell silent. But the legacy of that dark age, knowledge built by the dim light of the lights, still breathes.
in every missile that soars into the sky, in every submarine that glides through the depths, in every radar that scans the sky, a trace of those days remains. The war is over, but its shadows never seem to end.